right, well, let's call this meeting of the Policy Advisory Committee to order, and why don't let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. If we'd all stand, put your right hand across your heart and salute our flag and the Republic. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Josh, you want to take a roll? Sure.
Okay, do roll quick. Tim Carroll?
Present.
Ed Imson?
Present.
And can you get your name again?
Camille Anderson.
Anderson? Okay. Nice to meet you. I think we met last time, but nice to see you here officially.
Okay, thanks.
Judy Decker? Here. West Katzenstein?
Here.
Lyle Fisher?
Here.
Nick Panzer? Here. Renee Westalesk?
Here.
And that's Westa-Lesk. So I've got
Correct.
that right now.
Yeah, correct.
David Janik?
Here.
Okay, I believe we're missing one.
Yeah, we're missing James Maurer. Was there anybody else?
Josh, Josh.
Well,
I guess I should say Joshua Nugent,
yeah, you got it here.
and he is present. Bickenhouse, how did I get the last name?
That is Pat Quist.
Yeah. And Tom, and what was the last name again? Is it Bicken? I know I'm going to mangle it, so.
Bikoskis.
Bikoskis, okay. One of these days I'll get it. Don Zadiba. Here. And John Cairnsey.
Here.
And Lorelei Oviatt. Not
Right, she's not here already. Okay, we have a quorum. I think it's, as most of you know, our last meeting. Hope that's not the last time I messed that up tonight. Thanks, Don. Our last meeting was actually moved forward a week to June 27th because our regular meeting would have been on the 4th of July, and that would have been very interesting that evening. After that was that would have been okay. That would have been, well, I don't know. It would have kept us out of kept a few of us who were in the streaming video that went on every network for 5 days of running out of the restaurant during the 7-1 on the 5th. But anyway, where I was headed was we have some rocking and rolling issues on our plate for this evening. So we escaped it last time. We didn't escape it tonight. And as I said in my email last night to the PAC members, we're going to try to focus on these important issues, which are all related to agenda item number 5. So with that in mind, try to keep our focus on the other items, and once we get there to getting through this product productively, when you see the questions that we have, there's some real meat, some related to many things that were brought up in the TAC today. And I was pleased to see we had 8 or 9 members of the PAC there at the TAC, so Jeff, it makes your job a little bit easier, but we've had more time to think of tough questions for you. So with that, let's go to open public comment to begin with. Any comments from the public on issues that are not on our agenda? If an item is on the agenda, there will be public comment available at that time. Okay, seeing none, we'll move to review and approval of minutes for the June PAC meetings. We had 2.
And I was destroying the fisheries of Montana, so I apologize. So I will be being back in September with all the correct parliamentary stuff, the 2 Junes and today's. So, sorry about that.
Okay, and with that, I think, Jeff, you're on with a brief GSP update and review, and that will lead right into number 5.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Jeff Helsley with Stetson Engineers. Briefly on the GSP update, we had released a draft of Chapter 3 of the GSP and have received comments and are incorporating those comments now. And as was pointed out at the TAC meeting, that wasn't a complete Chapter 3. There was some items missing, but we wanted to get what we had done out for review and get comment on that. So we'll be incorporating the comments, filling in the pieces that weren't quite done at that time we released it, and getting another draft out. Chapter 2, I acknowledge, is overdue. It's been on my desk. It is off my desk now, so that should mean that it should get out to all of you within the next 2 weeks. It won't be next week because one of my key people's on vacation. Don't tell Steve. He didn't cancel his vacation. But then we should give that out to you. It was announced at the TAC meeting that one of the appendix to the GSP was provided to the TAC last night. That's the write-up on land subsidence. And then they're anticipating the appendix on model documentation, which will include the transport modeling documentation, should be out by August the 9th.
All of those are coming to us as well, correct?
They're technical. I have not. I'm
For
not
any,
sure about.
just if there is any policy consideration.
Yeah, I will double check on that. I certainly the modeling documentation I think is purely technical. Dave rolled his eyes, but I will check on the rest of those. I don't have an update. We have 2 more chapters, critical chapters to write, and I don't have an update on those. I think what will take place this evening and over the next few weeks and at the next board meeting will help us put together and make public a schedule about when we think we'll complete the next couple of chapters. We are working on the draft of Chapter 4, which has projects in it. We've presented some of the work we've done on imported water and recycled water. There are other aspects to the projects and management actions chapter that we are able to work on and are working on. Depending on the outcome of some of the things that are happening in the next few weeks, we'll have, I think, a schedule for that. So that's my update on GSP.
Okay, thanks. Any board or committee comment?
I just have a question. Actually, it's 2 questions. So Chapter 3 is done, so to speak, except for the parts that are missing?
The draft was out and we got comments, so we will be revising that. It's not final. We need to do some revisions to that. There were parts that weren't complete when we distributed. We'll add those parts, and it will still be a draft at that time and be available for review again.
Okay.
Right.
And then you mentioned Chapter 2. Is that going to be sent to us, or have we already received that?
You have not seen that yet. I anticipate it'll be about 2 weeks. We'll have that to both the PAC and the TAC.
And just to reference some of the discussion that came up at the TAC today, all the individual comments from this committee have been forwarded and have been appended to later documents that you've all seen. So we've seen each other's comments. We've had a chance to factor those in our own thoughts, and that will continue. As we get the new Chapter 3, I'll forward the individual comments, and then we'll have them available for everyone at the meeting and after. And that depends on the timing. We usually do the comments in that fashion if we don't receive them inside the Brown Act required time beforehand. And then they are usually sent out as part of the package of the next meeting. And tonight there weren't any because we didn't have a current GSP chapter to review. The only presentations that are going to be given tonight were both available on the TAC agenda website. They are the identical presentations. Okay, member comment? I'm sorry, public comment?
Derek Hoffman from Meadowbrook. Thank you. The question is, what is the status of the Capital Corps imported water memo? That would be part of the GSP status update. I know it was due to the board yesterday, and I'd like to know if it was submitted on time and when the committees will have a chance to review that.
Thanks, Derek. And let me address that by suggesting let's move the imported water update, which is essentially about 2 sentences from Don, and move that up at this point because we're going to spend a lot of time on number 7 or number 5.
Yeah, I know the commitment from Capital Corps was to have that by July 31st, but Their efforts have been focused this last month on getting the Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart grant application together, which is due July 31st. So they were putting all their effort into getting that in, and the memo hasn't been issued yet. But the grant application was submitted, and we did get confirmation that it was accepted. And the requested amount is $396,230, which is just below the $400,000 limit.
Right. And
That's for a water marketing and strategy plan.
Right, and I will add that they had a cornucopia of endorsements and supporting letters from community organizations and officials that supported that from all directions. And we also, I will say that related to that, what happened here on the 4th and 5th of July and the aftershocks and the assessments of what's happened in the community have given us an opportunity to make much more substantive contacts with people and understand the issues that surround this community, and water is being discussed as a part of those. And that is a part of the conversation and support that we may get for these kinds of things in the near future that could be considered some of a potential silver lining in the cloud of what Mother Nature forced us to deal with. So this is one of those, take the opportunity when it presents itself. Don't overdo it, but recognize there are opportunities that come out of crises and disasters. Anything else you want to add, Don?
No.
Okay. Any other public comment? Okay. With that, let's go to number 5, and let me set the stage. Jeff is going to go through the modeling scenario 6, and it has references to 3, 4, and 5 in the baseline done before it. And we will also talk about sustainable management criteria that was also presented at the TAC earlier today. He'll go through both of those. We'll have an opportunity for the public that didn't see them, board members that didn't see them, to develop and ask questions to understand what was in those scenarios, what some of the ramifications may be, issues surrounding them. And then as the Water Resource Manager, Steve Johnson, announced this afternoon, we got approval late last night. It wasn't late, I guess it was about 7:15 when I got the final approval for a set of questions, policy-related questions that are going to relate very much to the scenarios that have been run before, the sustainable management criteria, and what decisions and future scenarios that may be run. And that's what we're going to be dedicating our time to. And there's a lot of depth and detail in them. And given the breadth and the fact that this committee covers representatives of almost every pumper and user community in the basin, some with different interests, it will be a good, interesting conversation. We'll see if we can come to consensus on recommendations, because we're being asked for specific recommendations, and I'll talk more about that. If not, our ground rules had been before this, as they always have been. If we have minority opinions, they're obviously welcome. If we have some level of a majority opinion, we can do that too. We have this group normally represents a set of different opinions, and it in many ways allows the GA itself to get a sense of where the public is and where the groups are with regards to recommendations and reasoning behind them and issues that relate to each of us. So keep that in mind as you go through, as Jeff goes through this, try to understand it. When we have the questions, I will reopen it for discussions back on what you presented, because there's a lot of meat in this, and there's a lot of issues that interconnect, and you may want to go back and talk about a slide again as we go look at it. So we may or may not get through with these tonight. That's the depth of the questions and the issues that surround them. However, the objectives that the GA had in giving us these was to hopefully get some form of recommendations and levels of questions and inputs to them by their next meeting 2 weeks from today, the 15th of August. So if we do not finish the questions tonight satisfactorily to where we all believe we've not exhausted it, but gotten to the point where we think we've gotten the major issues that we want to have considered and any recommendations we have coalesced, then we would need to schedule a meeting next week in order to complete and get our inputs in time for consideration at the August 15th meeting with the Brown Act restrictions. So we've talked about for 3 months during this summer, we might have to do this. And this is probably the one meeting where I'm going to be really happy if we do finish tonight, but there's some deep stuff here we're about to talk about. So I asked the members of the committee to bring their schedulers with them, so we see if we can find a night or an afternoon for a quorum if needs be. And my purpose in saying this now is to focus our comments. So, okay, Jeff, with that, let's get going.
I'm going to talk about how Scenario 6 was developed, what the objectives of this scenario are. This scenario builds off of and was related to Scenario 4, so I want to go back and recap that a little bit. Gene Moran and I had come to the PAC meeting on June the 6th, I think it was, and presented the results of modeling Scenarios 3, 4, and 5. So this will be something you've seen before, but that was then, and we want to just bring it back up again. And then I will give a summary of what's in those modeling scenarios, and I will also present the results. Those of you who are at the TAC heard DIR, who are the modelers, present the results, but this time you only get me. And then we can have a discussion about that. So we had presented the results of scenarios 3, 4, and 5, which they had names attached to them, the white paper, the water buyout, and the immediate halt to pumping. Presented and discussed them with the board in May and June. The board indicated that scenario 4 was a potentially viable and acceptable solution, and gave us direction to make some modifications to scenario 4, which I'll talk about, and to do another model run. Some other things developed after that. At that board meeting where we were given direction to do some more modeling, the Navy had actually provided some additional information on their potential water needs, and that hadn't been digested when we talked to the board, so that got digested a little bit better, and the attorneys had some issues to talk about. We had a meeting with the Groundwater Authority's attorneys on July the 12th and reviewed some of the issues, had some agreement on what would go into scenario 6, including a different variation of scenario 4, which I'll talk about, but had been different than we had been planning prior to that meeting with the attorneys. All this goes to why it's taken us so long to get results out to everybody, because it's taken a while to settle exactly what the modeling run would be. And even after the meeting with the attorney, there was continued discussions about exactly how to do it. We had to give kind of a summary to the attorneys, make sure we were all on the same page, and make some revisions, and then get the files to DRI and get the modeling run. We actually have run 2 versions of modeling scenario 6. We refer to them as 6.1 and 6.2 and I'll go into the points of why we did that. So our objectives were one, to create an allocation and management plan based on using pumping in 2010 through 2014. That is the available pumping history we have from that time as a basis for allocating rights, and I'll go into that a little further, and also considering the highest beneficial use of water. The direction we got was to maintain a similar cumulative loss of storage as was seen in Scenario 4. And the way to do that is basically Scenario 6 should end up with about the same amount of total pumping that we saw in Scenario 4. And the new concept was that these blocks of pumping, instead of a prescribed ramp down or a required cliff pumping, a block or pool of water was created with some flexibility within that, but also with some limitations on it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And one of the other things we wanted to do was optimize some of the features of the modeling after we had looked at 3, 4, and 5. And I'll talk about what those consist of as I go through this. So to recap on modeling Scenario 4, which was called the water buyout, it assumed that management action started in January of 2022, so that the current level of pumping continued for 2020 and all of 2021. And then in 2022, some allocation and reductions took place starting in that year. One of them was that, in this modeling scenario, we're looking at extending the federally reserved water rights that are associated with the Naval Weapons Station to all the uses that support in the community that support the Naval Weapons Station. And that was done, as we explained when we were here last. There was some indication that as much as 86% of the economy in the area is tied to the Naval Weapons Station. At that point, we were using that as a basis to extend the federally reserved right to 86% of the domestic and municipal pumping that occurred. And we were defining that at that point as we were doing an allocation of pumping for everyone based on more of a state water rights approach. That is, that 2010 through 2014 period, a state water rights approach would be to look at pumping that took place during that period, and your allocation would be based on the lowest amount of pumping you had in any one of those years. And the other part of that is if you didn't have a continuous pumping history, you had a year within that time period that had no pumping, then you got no allocation. And we've had to do this based with the records that we have, which are not complete for that period. So we've had to make a lot of assumptions. So that was the starting allocation, the total allocation. We extended the federally reserved right over 86% of that allocation, and that 86% of that allocation to domestic and municipal use. That 86% did not ramp down in this scenario. The remainder of the allocation for domestic and municipal use did ramp down over a 6-year period, and all of the non-domestic and municipal water use, which is essentially large and small ag and industrial use, Searles Valley Mineral, that all ramped down over a 6-year period until the total pumping was about 12,000 acre-feet a year. And that pumping, that is what becomes the block, the non-municipal and domestic pumping, that is the small ag, the large ag, and the Searles Valley pumping that was allocated in those first 2 years when there really were no allocations, but it was basically the level they were pumping now, and over that 6-year ramp down. That was what was converted into a block of water that would be used by those parties in Scenario 6. And I'll talk about how those were allocated in a later slide. So we ramped down the pumping to about 12,000 acre-feet in 2027, and then Scenario 4 assumed in 2035 imported water would become available to be used for groundwater recharge and recharge the difference between the natural yield of the basin, the 7,650 acre-feet a year, and the level of pumping we were maintaining of 12,000 acre-feet a year. And This is what the results of that modeling scenario 4 look like from 2020 to 2040. If you look at the hydrographs, many of them actually rebound. Really, all of them that are in the parts of the basin with production, rebound and or stabilize. We have some that are still declining that are farther away, back up in the base where we really don't affect anything up there, and that has to do with the time for these actions to take place throughout the basin or have an impact throughout the basin. And what we saw in that time period is we still had, when you look at the color chart, the reds and oranges are declining levels. So over that 20-year period, we had total declining levels in the southeast and the southwest, and up in the northwest, we had increasing water levels. And when you looked at the whole modeling period, that is 2020 to 2070, you saw we did still continue, or the net over that period was lower groundwater levels in the southwest and the southeast, but even more increasing water levels up in the northwest area. And that was one of the things when I talked about optimizing pumping optimizing the modeling run that we wanted to do in scenario 6. This had indicated to us that to get the basin more in balance, that is to have less declining levels in the southwest and the southeast, we needed to move some of that pumping up into the northwest. So that's one of the things that's in scenario 6 that I'll go into. So here's a graph of the total change in storage in the basin for the baseline that we ran some time ago, which indicated over on the right took almost 1.6 million acre feet of water out of storage between 2020 and 2070. Scenario 3 is the red line, took almost 400,000 acre feet out of storage. The line above that is scenario 4, which took 213 acre feet total out of storage. And then the top line was scenario 5 that took about 126,000 acre feet of water out of storage. And among the things that the board looked at and reacted to was this graph, along with other considerations, and trying to look at what seemed like a reasonable amount of water to take out of storage. Scenario 4, around that level, was something that they wanted us to focus on and duplicate in scenario 6. So in scenario 6, we had the allocation that I've mentioned of water rights to what we're calling now the domestic group. We've divided pumpers into the domestic group and the non-domestic group. That equates to the municipal and domestic that I'd referred to before, and the ag and the industrial basically are in the other group. So in the domestic group, we did an allocation based on the 2010 to 2014, the lowest of those years. And those fairly closely matched the amount of current pumping by most of those parties, except for the water district. The water district is actually more recently pumping less than the lowest year between 2010 and 2014, so they would end up with a higher allocation than the amount of water they're currently pumping. One of the other things we wanted to do in optimizing this scenario is the Sigma requires us in our GSP to talk about growth, to discuss growth, and none of the modeling scenarios we had done prior to this had growth in them. So we added to the water district, and I know this group was scheduled to talk about growth and hasn't completed any kind of discussion on that. But just to see impacts on the basin, we just assumed a 1% per year growth for the water district's water demand in scenario 6, both iteration 1 and 1.2 have that growth in it. And we assumed that when the new wastewater plant and recycled water supply is available, that the city would use recycled water for landscape irrigation, which is what they use with all the water they pump. They'd stop pumping and use recycled water. And here's yes, I'm sorry.
Are you entertaining questions during your talk, or would you like to wait till afterwards?
Let's go ahead and do it during, since some of us have seen this
Yep.
before.
That's fine.
I had a question about growth. It seems like, from the Navy's point of view, they may want to reserve some of their federal allocation, hold it in abeyance for future growth on the Navy. Is that something that was considered? It looks like you did allocate growth to the water district, but was there any consideration of the Navy perhaps withholding some of their federal reserve for growth?
My understanding is they have, you'll see in all the modeling scenarios, we've used 2,041 acre-feet a year of pumping for the Navy. And that was their suggestion that for roughly current use, that's a number that we use in the modeling. They've been clear that was not their federally reserved right. In June, they released another paper that looked at historical use and what variations might be, and talked a little bit about future use, and that was a much higher number. I've forgotten exactly what the number was, 6,000 something acre feet, and they clearly said that was not the federally reserved water right either. So they have not specified what their federally reserved water right is. So certainly the GSP has to recognize that federally reserved right is there and can be exercised to meet the mission of the basin. For the purposes of the modeling scenarios, we don't have a good estimate of what that would be, when it would be. So we have looked at that as part of when we're putting this plan together and we're doing things like setting sustainability criteria, which we'll come to. That's one of those uncertainties that we need to have in mind. And when the board looked at how much water we were taking out of storage in scenarios 3, 4, and 5, that was one of the things they had in mind. Among many things was that uncertainty we have, because we don't know how their mission would change, and they're going to have the federally reserved water right to meet that mission when the time comes.
That specific discussion or point will come up in the sustainable yield discussions and criteria. They'll go into a couple of the questions we have.
I have two questions. My first question is, and these are kind of detailed questions, but I think they need to be addressed not in the model scenario, but they need to be addressed. Why are both Kern County and the city of Ridgecrest listed under domestic water use when their water is solely used for irrigation purposes?
The reason for that is we are using a state allocation approach for that group of pumpers, and the city and the county pump groundwater and use it on land that they own. They're an overlying water user, which other people in the basin are too, but they're an overlying water user, and they're a public agency. And the special counsel for the groundwater authority has told us that that's, I think fairly recently, a rather special class of, and others may dispute that, but the direction we've gotten from the groundwater authority's legal counsel is that's a rather special class of water right, and that group of water rights we aren't ramping down. So since their special class can't be ramped down either, they were put in that group. I guess it's not by definition, but by approach and how to apply what we do with their water rights.
My other comment is, and you said it this afternoon several times, that growth was attributed solely to the water district and future customers that they may have. You need to look at growth for those other entities that are for domestic purposes, the mutuals, the private well owner, and then Kern CSD. Otherwise, what you're saying is they do not have the ability to grow. Someone would not have the ability to sell their vacant land to someone to connect to a mutual or to connect to put in their own well.
We weren't proposing that the GSP say that the water district is the only one that could grow. What we wanted to, the water district's pumping is more concentrated. The mutuals and the domestic well owners are spread out over a larger area. We wanted to see the impact on the basin if there was growth in those more concentrated points of pumping in the model itself.
I understand why you did it for the model, but when you go further in writing about allocations and growth, you need to consider what I just brought up.
That sounds like a policy issue.
This is the policy committee.
I acknowledge that.
Yep.
Jeff, I got one quick question. Your allocation years of 2010 to 2014, that is in Sigma, right?
I don't think that is specifically in Sigma. The way it usually works is if you start an adjudication, it's the 5 years prior to that, and what legal counsel has told us, they're viewing the passage of the Sigma legislation as the start of that period. So that's where the Sigma doesn't say you have to do it that way. At least as I understand it, it's applying a state water rights approach to the Sigma.
Okay.
It's an interesting time in that we're marrying previous water law with Sigma.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Let's see. That's the water district. Oh, yes. And this is just what the allocations look like compared to the 2020 pumping. And the only difference between the allocations and the pumping, as I pointed out, is the water district. Although the water district continues to grow over time, so that number goes up at 1% a year.
And you mentioned in the TAC that the difference between the 7319 and the 6507 is the 6507 was based on 2017. Is that correct? Actual pumping?
I know it's more recent pumping, and I don't know if it's 2016 or 2017.
Okay.
Let's see. I'll read the version that I can see. Well, okay, so that was all about what we call the domestic. The non-domestic, they aren't given any part of the they aren't allocated water in the manner that the other group was, but they're given part of this pool or block of water that adds up to 63,836 that I described from scenario 4, which was the 2 years equivalent to what they had pumped under our assumptions in scenario 4 for the first 2 years plus the ramp down period. We assigned this block to the ag pumpers, large and small ag pumpers, proportional to their irrigated acreage, and the theory would be it would be their least amount of irrigated acreage they have between 2010 and 2014. We don't have annual acreages for everybody between 2010 and 2014. The only thing we have is the Farm Group letter of March 14th, which lists self-reported, here's our acreage in 2013 and our water demands, and here's what we think all the acreage, planted acreage will be in build-out and what the demand will be there. So we use the numbers from 2013 that they reported as their acreage. So that certainly is something that if we were going to do allocations and distribution of this, there'd want to be more work on. But that's what's in the model for the distribution of that 63,836 to the large and small ag. Searles Valley, we couldn't use that approach. There's no equivalent acreage to use. So we did theirs based on water use basis. That is, we took their water use their lowest water use between 2010 and 2014, and all the large and small ag between 2010 and 2014, their smallest use, and looked at how that 6386 would be distributed to all the parties, and that's the number we used for Searles Valley. We didn't turn around and use the numbers that came out for ag. We used theirs based on the other method. So there's a combined, or we used two methods for two different types of pumper. Now, the intent is these non-domestic pumpers would be given these allocations and some flexibility in how they use them. They can increase their pumping, annual pumping. They can decrease it. They can stop. But once they use whatever they're allocated, they're done. And the intent is all of it would be used by 2040, so we could show DWR. That's part of our management action to handle that pumping that way, and it is in fact done. For modeling purposes, we had to make some assumption. And by the way, the purpose for the blocks and the purpose for changing from scenario 4 to this scenario 6 is in scenario 4 we had a ramp down over 6 years. And the intent of the ramp down was to try and make a soft landing and not cut people off abruptly. But then the realization came that when you're gradually decreasing water available for agricultural use, at some point the economics are not there to continue to do it, so you are in effect, the ramp down at the end doesn't accomplish what you want. So the thought was to turn it in this flexible block to allow ag to figure out at what rate over what period they would use this block of water. For modeling purposes, we assumed the thing they would do was keep pumping at the levels they're pumping now until the block is used up. Some of them might choose to increase. Some of them might not. But that's what's in this modeling scenario. Is we just assume people will use whatever is allocated at the rate they're pumping now until it's used out. Let's see. So those are the ag and Searles Valley, the acreages that came out of that farm group letter, the resulting distribution of that pool of water, and then, frankly, because we were asked by one of the attorneys, we simply took the current annual amount of pumping that each of the parties was doing and divided that pool by it to get the number of years, and then converted the number of years to the number of months. There's an intent that there can be exchanges of leases, exchanges of water allocation. There can be a lease market, but this is just a straight conversion of the pools to months based on most recent pumping we have.
I had a quick question. I asked this in the TAC as well. So this is starting February of 2020.
That's correct.
So the way Mojave would read this chart is that starting in February of 2020, we have 8 months of operations before we're out of water.
Before the allocation is used up.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, and the difference I'm making is in the modeling, we assumed that Mojave would lease some water and pump. And that's just our assumption, and pump longer than that.
And that would be water that you would both pay the lease and pay the fees for as well.
Certainly pay the lease, and I would assume pay the fees on.
Thank you.
Let's see, and as I did this morning, I wanted to point out, Searles Valley Minerals has provided some additional historic pumping data to the Groundwater Authority's attorney. That's being reviewed right now, and nothing in this presentation reflects that because we haven't digested it and seen how to incorporate it here. But I want to acknowledge that there is more data that's come out to be reviewed. So, as I mentioned, this assumes there's a lease market. It assumes Meadowbrook would potentially be willing to, and in fact, in modeling, we assume they were willing to lease the rights, that the water district until its growth got to its allocation amount, it would have extra allocation, would be willing to lease that. That Ridgecrest would be willing to lease when it got recycled water. As a practical matter, small ag, some small ag may be willing to lease if they don't, if they see that as a better opportunity than their ag operation. But we did not assume that in this modeling, Ron. And we assume people that would actively be leasing for the purposes of modeling were some of the small ag, were Searles Valley Mineral, and that Mojave would lease some. Let's see. As I mentioned, to try and balance pumping and reduce some of the continued declines in water levels we saw in the southwest and the southeast, we assume some of the water districts pumping and Searles Valley Mineral would move up to North Brown Road, and I now understand why I needed to talk to the water district about that. There was an agreement regarding that some time ago that I need to look into. I appreciated the direction on that.
I had a quick question
Yes.
on the leasing. I realize that you're not setting the policy that's defining this model, but I thought I'd throw the question out there at large. And would it be possible for the Groundwater Authority to take out a bond and buy that leased water for the benefit of the community? Has that been considered? Or perhaps the water district might choose to buy a bunch of that leased water keep it in the ground. Just a thought. I realize you're not the right person to answer it,
Yeah.
but I'll accept any word you have to say.
Well, as far as keeping it in the ground, we've assumed, and this is just modeling, that the water district, when it had larger demands, would be in the lease market acquiring water for leases. Certainly, I think the Groundwater Authority would have the authority to buy that water and retire it. I'm not aware of any discussions that we've had about that. I've heard of other agencies, not under Sigma, just in groundwater management. I've heard discussions of that type of thing before.
I guess I have a question. Has there been any discussion about how much these leases will cost? I mean, does anybody have a sense of that, or who will set that market? Can somebody tell me something about that?
That's an important consideration. That's a key. One of the key considerations is the economics, and these modeling scenarios don't include the economics at this time. What typically happens is the market is driven by what's the alternative cost, and it's unclear at this point what that would be. The fee structure may be the key to that. If imported water came in and it were made available to all the parties, that would set the lease rate. How the fees are set up, if there's a fee for pumping above an allocation, which is the way some, in addition to fees that everybody pays, there are fees for pumping above an allocation in some basins, and that often drives a lease market. So I don't have an answer for what that will be. Those are the types of things that drive lease markets. The other thing is simply the economic need for it. Who has the highest economic need and can pay that amount is another potential consideration. Let's see. This modeling scenario, as with 4 and 5, assume that imported water is available in 2035 for groundwater recharge. That's what gets the basin in balance, the difference between the natural yield of 7650 and the pumping level of 12,000 that we've gotten the water pumping down to. It would also offset growth by the water district when it goes above its allocation. All of those assumptions that I've described in scenario 6, described for scenario 6 so far, apply to scenario 6.1 and 6.2. I'm now coming to the difference between 6.1 and 6.2. And that is, we had noticed in scenarios 3, 4, and 5 that even though we apparently got the basin into balance by 2040, that is, we offset all of the pumping with imported water or some other means, got the pumping down so it matched the net recharge into the basin. The basin continued to lose water from storage between 2040 and 2070. And both in basins 3, 4, and in scenarios 3, 4, and 5, it was between 54 and 56,000 acre feet total, not per year, but total. So it wasn't a huge number, but it continued to happen. And getting the basin in balance is an issue we have to address in Sigma. And the reason those scenarios were doing that was the ET down at the evapotranspiration down at the playa. It was taking water from the basin in addition to the pumping, and we weren't replacing it. So we added 2,500 acre feet a year of additional imported water starting in 2035 to offset at least a portion of that, to look at how that one mathematically would get a water basin budget more in balance, and how it would impact the water levels in the basin. And that's what we added into 6.1. And the difference between 6.1 and 6.2 is we took that out in 6.2. That's 6.2 has everything I talked about except for that. We did not include that in 6.2. And we'll talk about why we took it out. So that gets us to modeling results. I'll pause for a minute if there's any questions on the descriptions before I jump to the results. Okay, I'll go through some of these a little bit quickly. That's just a graph of the pumping. That's the recharge, showing recharge that was on the right, recharge that was in the baseline, and the recharge in 6.1, which includes imported water, which wasn't in the baseline. These are water level change contours. Yeah, let's see. That's the baseline on the left, right? And 6.1 on the right. And what we see is increases. The recharge site is out near Inyo Kern. It's shown in yellow on the figure on the right. And we see water rises, increases there. One, because we're doing recharge, and two, because over the 2020 to 2070 period, we have reduced pumping in the southwest and the southeast and moved some of it up to the northwest.
Yeah, I would point out that was one of the specific recommendations that you got from the PAC at the last meeting.
That's correct. There were observations that was not in balance, and we had noticed that too. This is the results of 6.1 for the period of 2020 to 2040. When you look at the hydrographs, we have some rebounds in the hydrographs, that is, they increase, but certainly they're all of them in the pumping areas have stopped declining by 2040. And when you look at the colored graph, the blues are increases all the way through the greens, and when you start to turn yellow, you're looking at decreases. So yellows into oranges are decreases, net decreases in water level over that period. So you see increases around the spreading facility and in the southwest and the southeast, and small decreases up on the northwest. But we've still got some pumping up there, but certainly not the decreases we had seen in the baseline. So if we look at the 2040 to 2070 period for scenario 6.1, so much greater increases around the recharge area in the southwest and the southeast area. And then that's the whole period, the 2020 to 2070, showing the increases, and still some net decreases over that period on the Naval Weapons Station and extreme southeast corner and up in the northeast corner of the basin. So these are the basin water budgets. The baseline is shown in the column on the left, and then different periods of time for scenario 6.1. You can see that the under inflow, the second line is the imported water recharge. There's none in the 2020 to 2025 period. Then when it comes online, 2035, there's some recharge, and then 2060 to 65 to 2070, it's increased. So we have an increasing amount of imported water that's going into the basin.
Why does the natural recharge row decrease over those 5-year periods?
Good question. That's because in the model, the 7650 we talk about is a long-term average, but the model has a varying hydrology based on history. It goes up and down. There's drought periods, and that's what you're seeing there. As you look at it and go, 26 to 2070 is a dry period in the model, and 2020 to 25 is a wetter period. Let's see. One of the interesting things when you go down to outflow, well, not so much in this model.
Jeff, going back to that question, it just occurred to me, it should have occurred to me during the TAC meeting. Is that where some of the variability from the USGS climate change model was incorporated?
Well, we want to be careful about that because, Tim had, this was in response to a question from Tim Parker, and it was a good question. It doesn't specifically incorporate climate change. To the degree the historical period that they looked back at had climate change in it already, we're carrying that forward. But the recharge that's in the model doesn't have specific changes to it for climate change. And some of that is based on reviewing the report that the USGS did, looking at recharge in the future that did consider climate change. They just didn't see enough in the USGS report on climate change to warrant changing these recharge files.
That's what I remembered from the USGS report, in that it changes the length and period, perhaps, of the drought, and refresh rates vary more. But overall, over a long period of time, there wasn't yet any data that showed a substantial change. Is that the way you understood it?
I'm not a climate change expert, but I think in general, I think Sigma and DWR have intended that you try and incorporate whatever that change is into these models. But we certainly, as we indicated at the TAC, will be checking with DWR and had intended on our plan to have that discussion about how do people view how it could impact things in the future. And we add that as one of our uncertainties. Even if we had incorporated it into the model, it's still an uncertainty about how it will really impact things. Absolutely. So when we go through to set our sustainability criteria and put our plan together, that's another uncertainty that we have.
I have a question on the same topic of the recharge fluctuations. In the time periods that you're saying there's less natural recharge because of drought periods or whatever, are you increasing the imported water to balance that out, or is the imported water based on a different scale?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think we take a long-term average for recharge, that it doesn't vary year to year, but over time we're offsetting that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well, and your assumption was imported water wouldn't be available till 2035.
That's correct.
Correct.
Yep.
Just for the model.
That's right. So this is basin water balances for 2020 through 2070, and it has the baseline scenarios 3, 4, and 5, and 6.1 out at the end there. One of the things I wanted to point out was when you go to, we're in the top table, the second group of numbers under outflow. The second item is evapotranspiration. And when you look at 4, 5, and 6.1, and I think we have probably a better slide to look at. But right, we've added water in 6.1 to try and offset evapotranspiration and get the basin in balance, yet you don't see much change in evapotranspiration between 4 and 6.1. That's one of the things that led us to question the usefulness of adding that water, and we'll talk about that some more also. Anything else I particularly want to point out? Well, one thing I want to point out is at the bottom table, which is the cumulative numbers, for scenario 4, when you go to the very bottom line, the amount of water total that's taken out of storage under scenario 4 was 214,000, which we were hoping to emulate in scenario 6. When you look at 6.1, because we are adding that extra water for the ET, the total amount that's taken out of storage is 126,360. So it's a smaller amount taken out of storage because we put more water back into storage. Here's a graph of the change in storage between 3, 4, 5, and 6.1 and baseline. 6.1 actually at the end of the period has the least amount of water taken out in storage. That's a result of putting more water in. Well, and we'll talk about the other comparisons when we look at 6.2. So I'll go to 6.2. The pumping's the same. The recharge is a little bit different because we are no longer putting in the 2,500 acre-feet a year to offset evapotranspiration. For comparison, here for the period 2020 to 2040 are the well hydrographs. I can't see any difference in them. Maybe if you did it at a different scale, you could find some differences. But they look very much the same. One of my conclusions is during the period we need to come into compliance with Sigma, the 2020 to 2040 period, at least on the issue of declining water levels, we didn't get a lot more benefit, at least looking at these hydrographs, when we added 2,500 acre-feet more water a year of imported water, starting in 2035. Now, we only had 5 years in this period where we were doing that, but this is one of the key periods that DWR will look at, and you don't see a lot of benefit to it in this time frame, at least for this consideration. Here's a water level change map for that same period, 2020 to 2040, between 6.1 and 6.2. And again, we just started putting the water in during the last 5 years of this period. You can see a little bit of difference around the recharge location on 6.1 when we're putting more water in. Very subtle differences beyond that for that 5-year period. It'll become more apparent when we look at a longer period. Here are the water level changes for 6.2 for 2040 to 2070 when we're not putting in that additional water. And what we see over that period is mounding around increased water levels around our recharge facility. We don't see the decreases down in the southeast and the southwest that we'd seen in scenario 4. We don't see as much of an increase up in the northwest area, but generally they're not. They are still increasing somewhat over there. So we think that does accomplish one of the things we wanted to look at in optimizing is eliminating some of the areas where we still had declining water levels. That's looking at the entire period. Shows we actually have some increase over that period in the southeast and southwest. And
Do I remember correctly, this is taking into account this 2020 to or 2040 to 2070 is taking into account a 1% growth?
Yes, that has 1% growth in it. Well, what I wanted to point out on let's see, what have we got? We've got 2020 to 2070. When we looked at 6.1, the 2020 to 2070, and 6.2, 2020 to 2070, you do see some increased water levels under 6.1, but it doesn't translate back up, towards the playa, towards the ET areas. You're meeting the objectives here of stopping the declines in water levels. Without that water, you aren't getting a lot of benefit other than be able to check out a box that numerically the water balance pencils out better if you put an additional 2,500 acre feet in. But over the period we modeled, that's 150,000 acre feet of water more that you're going to have to pay for and put in the basin. And at least with the other key criteria we need to look at, it's not getting us a lot of benefit.
I had another quick question for
Yes.
you. The recharge in the southeast, is that recharging areas that currently have non-potable water? I wonder if that's maybe beyond the intent of the model run, I understand.
Yeah,
Just a question.
The model is showing that the water could, I'm not sure exactly which area you're referring to, but if you see increases there in that area, it's a combination of the recharge we're doing and the reduction in pumping largely by the water district in that area are allowing the water levels to come up over that period of time.
Well, my question was this. My understanding is as you head towards Trona and the new Walmart, you're getting into areas where water is not real useful and perhaps wells have been abandoned. And it appears that maybe some of the recharge is occurring there. And I'm just wondering if that's a good use of the recharge, if maybe it'll repair those wells. But I guess so that's kind of the question. I realize it's beyond the scope of this model run.
Well, sir, I don't think our intent of doing it was to try and recharge over in that area. Really, just to get some water in the basin to try and stabilize. And I can't discern how much of the increases we're seeing there are from recharge, which are a little ways away, or are just rebounds because we've decreased pumping over in that area.
I have a question regarding why did you choose to change the pumping distribution in the 6.1 and 6.2 models compared to what was in scenario 4 originally?
The distribution, I think you said this correctly. The distribution in 6.1 and 6.2 are the same, but they're different than 4.
Right, that's what I mean.
That is correct. The reason being, see if I can get back to 6 point. It's back a ways. Click. Because in the southwest area, in scenario 4, all that red and orange is over that long period, there's a net decline in water levels. And up in the northwest area, we've got a fairly large net increase. And so that we could mitigate or avoid those decreases in the southern area, southeast and southwest, we moved the pumping there that was causing that up into the northwest area. So we had a more uniform water level change and increase. It's a smaller increase now in the northwest, but we're not seeing the decreases we're seeing. So it's to eliminate localized continuing declines in water level in the southeast and southwest, sort of optimize the pumping in the basin. I had one thing I wanted to point out on this chart. There are probably other things, but going to the bottom table and the bottom line, the change in cumulative change in storage, groundwater storage, as I pointed out in 6.1, we'd had 126,000 acre feet removed from storage. In 6.2, it's 213,000, so it's very close to scenario 4, which was the general direction we were given by the board to work in that area of use of water and storage. And there's a graph of 4, actually scenario 4 and 6.1, 4 and 6.2 lay right over each other. It's hard to see that there's two lines there. The top blue line is 6.1, and then the other line that continues to go down is the baseline. And looking at evapotranspiration, 6.1, you did see some a relatively small increase in the evapotranspiration, but 6.2 matched 4 pretty closely. And that's the presentation I have on our most recent modeling run.
Questions on this before we go to the public? For any questions on this scenario?
I just have a statement I'd like to make real quick. On behalf of Mojave Pistachios and Nugent Ranches, I just want to say that I'm a little shocked and disheartened by this proposed modeling scenario. The collaborative spirit of SGMA and the express directive to take into consideration all stakeholders, including agriculture, has been ignored and upended by the closed session processes that have arrived at such an inequitable proposal. It seems that our water rights are being taken in an arbitrary and capricious way in closed sessions, ignoring our $25+ million investment in the livelihood of our farmers and workers. Mojave Pistachios and Nugent Ranches wish to retain the right to comment further in writing after a vigorous legal review, after such a catastrophic and disastrous proposal was presented to the PAC and the TAC mere hours ago. Thank you.
Public comment?
Let's
Oh,
finish
wait a
with
minute. We got a couple more member.
First of all, is that microphone on now?
Yep.
Yes.
If you would all do me the big favor of speaking directly into the microphone for my hearing. And, you know, it seems to me that everybody's exempt except agriculture. Secondly, agriculture gets ramped down to 0. Whether it be in 5 years or 10 years. So I'm not sure that we agree with that scenario. And on a personal level, on my own crop, I want to digress a little bit and talk about beneficial use. My current crop, alfalfa, uses a lot of water. But I guarantee you it's on your plate every day. Whether it be in milk or yogurt or ice cream or butter or meat, fast food hamburger, are non-productive dairy cows anymore. And the steers that they have over their lifetime become choice cuts. Now, personally, I am going to adapt because I think this SGMA law is a good law. We need to be sustainable. And I have found a way in a crop that I can change to that I think is excellent quality, very nutritious, and uses 1/4 of the water that alfalfa does. So that would be a big reduction for me to do my part in sustainability. And, you know, it's funny to me that we look at these laws, like Nick looks at this SGMA law and tries to nitpick it to make it fit his scenario, that domestic use has a higher priority than agriculture. And I think Mr. Markman told us right at the beginning, at least in California law, that's not the case. Neither one, agriculture or domestic use, has a priority over each other. They're of equal importance. And I suggest to you that the food on your plate is a national security item, just like the Navy. I have no problem with the Navy. I've been a good neighbor to the Navy, and they've been a great neighbor to me for 22 years. So I think I'm done. And please, whatever we do, speak in your microphone so I can be part of the conversation.
I'd like to strongly support the last two comments.
Say that again, please, Tim.
I would like to strongly support the last two comments.
Thank you. Any other member comments? Okay, public?
Don Decker. The interest that we all have, of course, is in understanding, managing, preserving the potable water portion of our aquifer. Little Lake Fault that is incorporated in the DRI model is assumed to have a lower hydraulic conductivity, basically. And so we see the effect of that in the decreasing water levels on the northeastern side of the fault. Part of our environmental issue here is not just potable groundwater, it's also air quality. And if we intentionally allow that area to the northeast to dry out further and further, we will end up with an Owens Lake situation, and we are very close to that right now. I'm sure you've all noticed in the last few years the strong winds, the really white dust that's stripping off of the China Lake Playa itself, mostly on strong west winds. That's a situation that's on a large enough scale you can easily see it on Google Earth, by the way. I'm pointing this out. I was going to say something today at the TAC and didn't. We had lots of things to talk about, and I'm just mentioning it here, and I'll put it into my notes, my comments, but we must not ignore that northeast part in our attempt to optimize our production of potable water on the other side.
Thank you, Don.
Sophia Merck. Going through this presentation, I noticed that there is only one federal agency that is listed in this whole scenario. BLM is a federal agency. They should also be in this part of this booklet. They do have water rights. They are a federal agency. Second of all, I was looking at the differences between the domestic and the non-domestic, and I was wondering why the city of Ridgecrest is also not on the non-domestic. They have an alfalfa field. If you're going to lump the farmers into non-domestic, shouldn't you also put the city into that same group? They do have an alfalfa field. I know that they use recycled water for it, but it's still what you might call non-domestic. And I do feel personally that this scenario is picking on one group of individuals, and there must be a way to make it more equitable. The farmers, I eat meat. Alfalfa is grown for the cattle. I drink milk. I think we need to be nicer to our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Good evening. I'm Tom Bunn, attorney for Searles Valley Minerals. Jeff, in your description of the modeling scenario that was given to you, you had that block of water that the non-domestic people could choose over what time period to use it. But you said that it all had to be used up by 2040. What's the reason for that? Doesn't it make sense to leave it in the basin as long as people are willing to do that?
I think one of the thoughts behind it is that they were trying to show that management action about how to address that non-domestic pumping, that action was complete by the 2040 period. I frankly think, that's one of the elements that could be discussed further. I think the way we've modeled it is how the assumption we've made, but how the policy goes forward about what's in the management action itself, what the board decides, that could be a topic for discussion. There frankly, were discussions of doing it both ways, and I wouldn't say that one was a firm position by the groups that discussed it this far. So that's potential.
Well, my client, as you pointed out, is a potential buyer of water. And I can envision some scenarios where we would want to buy water early and then hold it. So I would encourage you to bring that back to the board.
Thank you, Tom.
Derek Hoffman, attorney for Meadowbrook. I was here earlier. I'll just kind of reincorporate my comments from the TAC meeting and just ask that you refer to those also for today as a comment here at the PAC meeting. And regarding the modeling scenario that was presented, we heard at the PAC, and we've heard a little today about some of the assumptions that are included in the scenario. And the answers that were given were based on questions that people had. But what I'd like to know is, would you present an entire list of all the assumptions for the scenario and for all the scenarios, so that the PAC and the TAC, if they're being asked to weigh in on a scenario, they need to know what all of the assumptions are with respect to that. And so one of the additional questions I have for you, Jeff, is you mentioned moving pumping up to the northwest area, and my question is, where is the location of that pumping that gets moved? Is it simply replacing where existing wells are located, or are they additional wells that are sunk or drilled in that area? What is the assumption there? And would you be willing to share with the PAC and the TAC a list of all the assumptions in the scenario and not just the summary that's included in these slides?
This modeling scenario, and I don't have the details, I think initially about 3,000 acre-feet a year of the water district's pumping and a much smaller part of Cyril's pumping is moved up to the northwest area. And then in a later period when they go above, when their demands go higher and they need additional water, I think another 3,000 or 4,000 acre-feet a year of pumping is moved up into that area. And essentially in the model, they are moved up in the same location the pumping is occurring now, around where Meadowbrook and Mojave are pumping. That's, for the purpose of modeling and ease of putting files together, it was easy just to assume the existing wells there. Whether that would be what in reality would happen might be a different matter. And I'll speak to Steve, to the water resource manager, about more information on assumptions in the modeling.
Thank you. I know I'd appreciate that. So to summarize that comment, what the assumption is Meadowbrook, Mojave Pistachios, and other large pumping is eliminated, and the water district and perhaps other pumpers pumping goes into that same exact location. Is that correct?
I think I described it.
Okay. Yeah, and so I think the way I'm saying it, which is accurate, is a more telling version of what's happening here. And so I think you can all understand why Meadowbrook would consider that to be inequitable, especially when Sigma is about significant and undesirable results. It's about sustainable management criteria. So if you're going to remove one pumper and just put someone else exactly where they're pumping, then how does that tie into sustainable management criteria? Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk.
Anita M. Sand, Meadowbrook Dairy. So the GSA paid Lynn Ricker $2,000, which we know Lynn, to do an appraisal on our farm. So does that mean that the GSA is going to do condemnation or eminent domain?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Hi, Tim Parker. I'm a consulting hydrogeologist to Indian Wells Valley Water District. I report to Don. I just wanted to say a few things because I want to make sure it's clear when I make comments who I'm representing and what. I don't have a horse in this race. I want to make sure everybody understands that. The way I look at my job is to make sure that we get a GSP that is well put together and defensible, and we do it in a cost-efficient way. And I'm looking out for the water district in that sense. And I've done groundwater management planning for almost 20 years. That's been the focus of my work. And I'm very familiar with SGMA. I worked on the legislation during its development and understand its intent. What kind of worries me about what's happening right now is there's some things missing. And I haven't seen the questions that this committee is going to be asked. But I think there's some information missing. And these are just modeling scenarios. We heard that today. They're not decisions. It's information to use in making policy decisions. But some of the things that I don't think are out there that typically do in a planning process is when you put together information, number one, what's the storage, the total usable storage in the basin? And have we used the best available science to determine that, number one? So, and I don't know that we're there. So that's one. And when we're talking about storage and using storage as the critical sustainable management criteria, I think you really have to have a good handle on that and what the uncertainties are associated with that. Number two, when you're talking about making policy decisions or giving policy direction on something like these scenarios, I think there's some information missing. What are the costs? What are the risks? When you're talking about, really forcing the issues to the courts, what are the costs and risks with that? Some of the questions that come to my mind, so if you really push this in that direction, how long will the pumping continue in reality? And what are the authorities, what can the authority do, the groundwater authority, do to stop that pumping? Because if you end up in a situation where pumping just continues for another 5 or 10 years, what have you gained by trying to force it really quickly? And so I don't know the answers to these, but typically when you do this kind of analysis, you combine the projects and management actions into alternatives, and you do a feasibility level kind of analysis where you look at these different factors. And that's what you use to kind of form your policy decisions. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you all to consider. And again, I'm not going to, that's your decision on what kind of information and input you have. I don't have, that's up to you. I'm just trying to make sure that the information's there. It's going to be defensible in the GSP. And I'm helping Stetson. The way I look at it is I'm trying to help Stetson in that factor. So that's all I had to say. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tim. Any other public comment? Okay, with that, Jeff, let's go to the sustainable management criteria pretty quickly because it's going to bear heavily in some ways on what Tim just raised and others have. And question number one.
David, I don't have a list of the questions. Did
Nobody
everyone
does.
get one? Okay.
They'll be coming.
Did you want me to go through the whole, or
Go
did
through
you have
the-
particular
go through-
slides in mind, or I'll?
Go through the first part pretty quickly, and when you get near the end, it gets to the relevant pieces to our questions.
Okay. The Sigma calls for 6 sustainability indicators: chronically lowering groundwater levels, continuing reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and depletion of interconnected surface water. We've got to we have to create sustainable management criteria in the GSP, and there's these 5 components to sustainable management criteria. We have to define what the undesirable results are. We have to establish minimum thresholds. We have to have interim, and those minimum thresholds, that's the point we don't want to get to in managing the basin. That's a bad thing. Interim milestones are how we show that we're making progress in our 5-year reviews that we need to do with Department of Water Resources between now and 2040. And our measurable objective is where we hope we will get in 2040 to show that we've got all the desired management actions and projects and are addressing all the undesirable results and meeting our sustainability objectives. And the sustainability goal is sort of an overall qualitative description about how we're doing these things. And when you look at a well hydrograph, this is DWR's figure, this is how these things look if you're setting these things as water levels. And there are other ways to do them, depending on what criteria or indicator you're looking at. But for something like declining water levels, you've got a minimum threshold, which is the red line. You see they do dip below that there initially, which they don't want to do. If they stayed down there, they would have to tell DWR, here's how we're correcting that action. They are out of compliance when they're down below that line, and they would need to tell DWR how they're changing their plan to get back into compliance. But what they're, if they're in the 2020 period and they're showing those black dots, which are their interim milestones, they're showing, here's how we think we're going to make our way back up to where we think we need to be, and that star at the end is, here's where we think we need to be to get our basin sustainably managed. And the difference between that star and the minimum threshold is the margin of operational flexibility, and a lot of things can go into that, and a lot of things we've already talked about. Uncertainties in what we're looking at and the information we have and how things will change in the future can all go into considering the difference between where we think we need to be and where we think this threshold is that we don't want to get to. We've got to give descriptions for each one of those components of sustainability criteria that talk about what are they, what criteria have we used to establish them, what are the potential impacts. I'll go through some of these kind of quickly. These are some of the typical ones that the metrics for each one of the indicators that DWR was anticipating, and that means that the way that you show you don't have continually lowering groundwater levels is you set a threshold groundwater level. That's the simplest one to think about. And all of your interim milestones are groundwater levels, and your objective at the end is a groundwater level. Reduction of storage, one way to do it that they've suggested as a metric is every year we calculate what the total volume of storage is or what the total change in storage is. Another way to do it is to show, well, look, our groundwater levels are tied directly to how much water is in storage. So as a threshold and as an indicator, we're going to use groundwater levels as a potentially way to show how we're meeting our goals to prevent a reduction in storage. I think those are the most applicable to what we are doing. We don't have seawater intrusion to worry about. Degraded water quality. There are different ways to do that. If you have, let's say with TDS, if we had a line that showed where's in the basin of existing water quality, what's acceptable TDS and what wasn't, we could use that line, some level for distance for that line to advance. I think we will eventually probably tie that to a water level also based on the modeling we've done, because in the modeling we have at least an estimate of what a number of the indicators impacts will be, and I think water levels are going to be our thing we can manage and a good indicator for these things like thresholds and interim milestones. This is talking about using groundwater levels as proxy for all those indicators, which I went over in the metrics there. And the bottom bullet says simply you can set a different water level for each one of those indicators. Like you could have a different one for water quality than you have for groundwater and storage, or if it works, if you can show that if we maintain this water level in this particular well, we've met our criteria for water quality. For certainly, if we're doing declining water levels, we're also stabilizing reduction or eliminating reductions in storage. So you can use one water level at a well as one of our indicators for a number of these things that we need to look at. And I anticipate that's probably what we'll end up doing. And we'll have more discussion on that.
And I wasn't looking for, this is the technical part of the discussion. What we wanted to do was, there's a very technical part of the sustainable management criteria and the concept you're presenting as to whether water level as a proxy for all of these could in fact be used. And then if so, the scenario number 6 suggestion came up with a number that said that was the acceptable piece. So I don't know that it's useful except to breeze through this part of it. This was which wells you're using and the TAC inputs for different ones, perhaps.
I agree. Just point out that we're going to use all the wells, all the data from all the wells in the basin to do things like contours and really look how the basin is, basin conditions going forward. But we will set a few key wells in our GSP that we need to report on and point how we're performing. And this is one iteration of that. And we got some good comments from the TAC today on some potential changes to that. This just shows the management actions we have to address all those sustainability indicators. I mean, these are the things that will end up in the plan, and tentatively, it's things like an imported water project, a recycled water project, more conservation, pumping allocations potentially, pumping optimization, shallow well mitigation. Okay, here we get to the part I think we want to talk about, as David was describing here. One of the things that the board has been focusing on is reducing the amount of water that is taken out of storage, maintaining water in storage. And the way we see it is one of the things that could be done is all those a number of the sustainability indicators. We could, as David was referring to, we could look at the modeling results we got from 6.2, look at the hydrographs, look at the change in storage, and the reason the board had us look at it to bring it back to them is they're in looking at 3, 4, and 5. This level of use of storage looked like it might be something that's viable to them. We could use that reduction in storage and the corresponding changes in water level we saw in the hydrographs to start setting water levels as our sustainability criteria. Now, the important things to consider in setting that, I mentioned we'll have a minimum threshold, we'll have an objective. Even setting the minimum threshold, we have modeling results. Whether we want to set them, if it was agreed, that's exactly what we want to do. We probably wouldn't set it exactly where the model says the bottom of a hydrograph is before we turn around. There are uncertainties in there that we need to consider. And one of the reasons we might consider using that information, and the board, frankly, is looking at that issue and that criteria of reduction in storage is the reasons listed here is the reason for using it, but some of the things in figuring out how to set numbers to it are those uncertainties that are listed in that last set of bullets, which we've talked about. We have the best tool we have, which is the model we have. It is not perfect. No model is. There's uncertainties. We had talked about the Naval Reserve right. We haven't included full use of that directly, and their mission could expand at some time, and they have the right to do that. Climate change impacts. We've assumed imported water will be available in the modeling scenarios, and we'll lay out a plan or how that will be approached in the groundwater sustainability plan. But it's not certain that it will, and the date that it arrives is not certain. So we need to think about that uncertainty if we were setting a groundwater level as our sustainability criteria. And impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems. We've seen that our management actions don't really, the areas are so remote from where we're taking our actions, we don't have a lot of impact on that. So this really goes to that same subject is, we could look at those modeling results, look at where do we want to draw a line about how far we want to go. Is it the results of 6.2, and you could start to put groundwater elevations to it, allowing for uncertainties, allowing for hydrologic cycles of wet and dry, and then look at how would that work for groundwater quality as a proxy. Does it work for all of our other indicators as a proxy or not? And that's something we think we'll be undertaking here. We have to undertake shortly. And I think that was the end of the sustainability.
Yeah, and what I do is, Gary, if you could leave 47 up there, please.
Is that 47?
Yeah, number 47 in the slide deck. It's number 12 in the handouts from the PAC meeting, or the TAC meeting today. Second to the last one in this presentation.
Second to the last. That one?
It's that one.
There we go.
Okay. I think I had flicker vertigo a while from what the screens were doing in front of us. Holy cow. We've spoken more gibberish than normal. That was why. Yeah, there it goes again. I'm sorry I ticked it off. Okay. I'll open it for comments on just this brief, but we're going to get into great detail on this in just a moment when we see the questions. Do we have any public comment on this before we see the questions? We'll be into this in great detail.
I have a question.
Okay.
I don't understand exactly what this proxy is about.
In the case of, let's say, groundwater and storage, the DWR's slides suggest that we would use something like a calculation, that every 5 years we would do a calculation of how much water is in storage, and we'd set a goal for that, and that number is what we would provide to them as showing how we were complying. The proxy is we could, since the amount of water in storage is directly related to the groundwater levels, we could simply say our goal in 5 years, 10 years, 15, and 20 years is to have a water level in these key wells of this much. That's a proxy or a representation of how much water is in storage. Rather than talking about a storage number, we'll talk about a groundwater, a physical thing we can actually measure, a groundwater level measurement out in a well to show them. So the groundwater level becomes a proxy or a substitute for talking about how much water is in storage.
But it was also a proxy for all the rest of the criteria, which you had stated the storage level itself is a proxy for.
It potentially is. I mean, I'm starting to think it is. But
well, and that was kind of what was implied at the TAC today, and you got some comments on both sides of it, but the majority seemed, and they're going to put in their individual comments, and we'll see better if, in fact, that is so. But it pertains very much to the questions.
A comment, in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if we perfectly understand all the water that's underground, which of it is potable and which isn't. And you mentioned that there are general basin and model uncertainties, I would assume that that's contained in that. To me, that is a risk area. You know, we might have a lot more good water in storage, and we might have a lot less than we're imagining, just based on the quality of that water. So you might add groundwater quality as part of your proxy. If you start finding more and more groundwater that's becoming bad, that might tell you that, gee, there are some areas of the groundwater storage that we presumed were good, may not be good.
I think there are uncertainties there. I mean, we have some, and people here have a better knowledge than I do about where the good quality water and the bad quality water is. I don't think any of us know really well how it will move. If we continue to pump the way we are, how that water will move. There's some general thoughts, I think some good thoughts, but we don't truly know, and there may be other things we don't know. So I think there's uncertainty in water quality also.
I just had a quick question. The questions that we're about to review that are going to be so important, were those sent out to us at all, or is this just?
No, they were.
I know we just got the modeling scenario this morning, and some of us traveled, and then now we're supposed to answer a series of substantive questions about something that we've barely reviewed. So I just, even before we see them, I want to lodge a protest.
And that's why this is part of why
it's difficult to make what are supposed to be such impactful and grand decisions on something that we just got presented to us, that we didn't even have the questions while we were listening to it, so we could try to form some type of a cogent thought.
Right, and that's why the first thing we're going to do after we get the questions and understand them is go back and ask more detailed questions if we need them from Jeff.
Just to point it out again, it's nice to have it a couple days in advance because we're supposed to represent a group. Each of us are not up here as individuals. We're up here representing our constituent groups. So
I agree with you completely.
I can't text out all the ag people. I mean, this is just a very unfair venue for us to make substantive comments.
I agree with that also.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think, is my microphone on? I think just, how about now? Yeah. I think that having another meeting next week is a good idea. We need a little time to take some of the stress off and look at some of these policy issues that really are going to affect at least agriculture's life. I have a second thing that I want to say. Groundwater resources are deemed the primary encroachment concern issue for NAWS China Lake. That may be, but my hydrogeologist, Eddie Teasdale, said when we first hired him, hey, let's get some real data. So we put transducers in as many wells as we could get them down. My field 1 and 2 is right next to Rusty. Maybe you guys know Rusty. He works out at the airport, been my neighbor for 22 years. He says his well hasn't changed in 5 years. My transducer data backs that up.
Thanks, Ed. Tom?
Sure. I don't say a whole lot here, but I wanted to comment on your criteria. I noticed the last criteria, the impacts to the natural ecosystems. Very important to keep that on there. Don Decker came up and he made reference to the one of the maps, and basically the drawdown of water in the northwest part of the study area. He's got a really good point. Don't let one area suffer just so you can reach the criteria in another, because the whole area matters. And if you get to the point of desiccation, you're going to be in Owens Valley situation where you're spending millions of dollars trying to fix other problems. So try not to ignore that.
Thanks, Tom.
I've got a comment. I tend to think we don't have enough water. And I'm not saying that just, we're talking about having about half of the water we really need. And the basin is not going to give us what the valley has in mind for its future. So whatever plan we come up with, we're going to need about, another 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 acre feet of water. and we're going to have to have a good place to put it. Because you put water in the ground and go to get it back, the hydrogeology can change, and you don't get it all back, and it doesn't come back in the same quality. And you may not want to import water that doesn't have the quality to begin with. So the real thing we've got to do is figure out how to get more water, and not necessarily, beating up. You guys were given, here's some assumptions, run some scenarios, and we learned a lot about our aquifer. The main thing we learned is there's not enough water. So we're going in the wrong direction, although the criteria that we were given kind of got us here. But we've got to get going in the right direction pretty soon.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, Jeff, you got the questions to distribute?
Can you please tell us where these questions came from?
Came from the GA board. Well, the staff put together a set of questions, and the GA decided to release them to us last night and ask for our inputs, as I mentioned before, prior to their meeting next week, and these will go out to the public in association with this also prior to that meeting next week.
I think they're out front. If anyone wants to grab one. August 1st, PAC tasks 1, 2, 3, 4, and in questions A, B, and C. So the public does have them. This is a new model for transparency, though. I appreciate it.
Yes.
The pack up front. It was there. Just not the actual pack members got it.
Yeah.
I think they put the wrong package for our package. Well, no, normally they have them up here for the pack numbers because they have different items than what's available.
It's 3 questions.
There's a lot more than 3. We're about to go through them. Yeah, that's it. There's a lot more than what's. There's multiple questions in each one. We'll talk about that in a second.
Mr. Chairman, would you take a public comment before you jump into the
Sure.
questions? Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Derek Hoffman for Meadowbrook. On this slide, the approach for setting criteria, I understand it's a PowerPoint slide. It's meant to be helpful. It's meant to give some thought to the criteria. But I would actually remind the PAC that there's an entire best management practice document that has been put out by the Department of Water Resources. It's lengthy. It's probably the lengthiest of the BMPs, of the best management practices documents. And it is the most lengthy because it's one of the most important, I would argue. And I'm looking at just some of the initial pages of that, and it talks about, among other things, the preliminary activities before you begin establishing sustainable management criteria. And 3 of the high-level headings, and this is just scratching the surface. It says you need to understand the basin setting, and it talks about having a thorough understanding of the historical and current state of the basin. It talks about having an understanding through the hydrogeological conceptual model, the water budget, and a description of groundwater conditions. And I would point out that the draft of that chapter is still not even complete for this GSP. The other element here that it mentions, and again, this is just by way of example, is to inventory existing monitoring programs. and reminds everyone that you set minimum thresholds at individual representative monitoring sites. There were comments earlier today at the TAC meeting about whether certain locations are or should be considered viable monitoring sites and locations. Just, again, one example. And the third high-level item here I'll mention that's in the BMP for establishing sustainable management criteria is to engage interested parties within the basin. And it says here that GSAs are going to have to explain to DWR the decision-making processes and how the public was used in developing their GSPs. So I think that goes along with many of the comments that have been made here tonight about needing time to consider these important issues and the process by which we've gotten to the point we are today.
Thanks, Derek.
Did the board have a board meeting last night?
No.
I said, did the GA board have a board meeting last night to give you these questions?
Not that I know of.
Not that I know of. The questions were attached to the packages that were out front. I don't know if you all picked up a package.
Okay, I have backup copies just in case something like this happened.
There were 3 left here.
Just while we're actually getting the questions, I want to say that one of the things that are worse than a lack of transparency is faux transparency. And so just giving window dressing that because we were allowed 10 seconds of review is not the same as allowing substantive review and comments.
Okay, if everybody has the questions in front of you, the top half of the document is really a four set compilation of the background information that was presented in the briefs that Stetson did today, that Jeff just did. It's a summary. Does everybody at that table have them? Okay, and the 4 of them, just so you all see them, Model Run is 6 is a refinement of Run 4, or the buyout scenarios with 2 years of current pumping plus 6 years of ramp down by equal increments for unprotected or non-M&I, what they categorized as non-domestic allocations. In Model 6, total water available is the 63,836, which is the total non-pumping allowed in Model Run 4 during the initial 2 years plus the 6 years of ramp down. In Model Run 6, if a producer did not pump groundwater continuously during the 5-year calculation period, which we've discussed, 2010 to 2014, then that producer will be excluded from the ag industrial pool. Transfers are allowed among the M&I producers and non-M&I pumpers that are eligible for the ag industrial pool. Model Run 6 assumes each producer would be allocating a percentage of the ag industrial pool for future use or transfer. The decision when to pump or transfer said allocation will be at the discretion of the pumper. And getting down to the three questions, of which there are really 6 buried in just the first 2, and the third one was not critical for the board meeting next week, 2 weeks from now. The first 2 are, and it is what the PAC requests are inputs on the following factors that are being considered by the board and with regards to policy and recommendations. So the first major one, A, is how much water should be allocated to that pool. The model assumed 63,836. Is that the right number? They would like the PAC's input and recommendations on that, and that's why it's relevant to the sustainable management criteria. In essence, how much mining of the basin should the GA allow by non-M&I pumpers? Recall that the more water mined from the basin results in additional potential impacts to domestic shallow wells that will need to be addressed. And that was mentioned today during the TAC as one of the criteria. And then there is a next question beyond that, buried in this question, is should a portion of that pool, whatever it is, be earmarked for dust mitigation, getting at some of the issues that Tom and others have brought up today. So there's really three questions in that first one. It gets to, with regards to sustainable management criteria, is that the right sustainable management criteria for what should be mined from the basin beyond the M&I use, or should it be some other number, larger or smaller? And in this case, this pool for model purposes is being taken out of the ag side of the house. That could be considered, being an engineer and having done theses on modeling in my career, that can be used for other purposes as well as at a top level in a series of modeling. However, we're looking at it in this application for this particular scenario and inputs for ag. And the second question, the second B question, we'll get right to more details of that. What I would suggest is I'll continue to go through each of these, and then we'll talk about and see how much we would be able to do tonight. And it is just exactly that why I was pretty sure we would need to have a meeting next week. So we did, in fact, have full time to discuss, think about, evaluate, and come back and have a more cogent discussion to arrive at answers to these questions if we could. So B is, if this is the ag pool, how should it be allocated to the eligible pumpers? The scenario 6 allocated it based on acres. And in fact, you saw the acres in the scenario. We have document that will go with this, and we'll pass. It should be passed out also. I don't know, Tom, do you have the water usage comparison with the acres one? It probably got in the package too. It's an expansion of the slides that were in the scenario.
Yeah.
And it gets to the issue of finishing the reading. On the basis of each producer's lowest water use during the 2010 through 2014 calculation period, or by the percentage of acreage farmed by each producer during the calculation period. And what was assumed in the model was the acreage model, or acreage method. Using acreage as equitable way of correlating water among overlying users. Allocations based on pumping during the calculation period are based on the concept of self-help during a prescriptive period. And here's a third question, other thoughts or factors that should be considered. And then lastly, C, which is not necessary to be answered by the next board meeting, is what method do you think the GA should use to reach out to small well owners to notify them of the upcoming mandatory well registration? Postcard, letter, billboards, and any other thoughts we had. So that's what we've been asked to provide recommendations for, and given the timeline prior to the GA board meeting that's laid out for Brown Act considerations, we would have to meet next week and come to as good an agreement as we could, consensus, minority opinions, etc. But having discussed this, having had time to consider it, that's what's on our plate.
All right, can I just ask real quick, who drafted this?
I think the GA staff did with some input from some of the GA members.
Well, when you say staff, I think it's the legal staff, not staff in general.
I don't know. I don't know who was in. I think Steve was probably involved in it because he's usually involved in those legal discussions.
I believe so, but I think it was a result of a meeting of the lawyers.
It'd be nice to know, like if these are just from like an audience member or guy on the street or water resource manager. I mean, it'd be nice to have a little more background on who's asking these questions.
It says the board.
Yeah, there's been continual. The PAC has made it clear they felt they were underutilized and wanted more input, and there have been continual discussions at a staff level, at the attorney level, on what could be put forward, and this was one of those efforts, and the attorneys for the GA members wrote this and revised it among themselves, and Steve and I saw it. I'm not sure if we provided comments on it, but we did see it at one point. I think Steve was offering emails suggesting they resolved whether they were going to get it to you so they could get it to you. Was his main input into that. And it, you know, as is done between board meetings, there was coordination, as I understand it, with the president and the vice president of the board on this.
And the document does say at the top, the board is asking us to do this. And this is what we've been asking for to weigh in on for months.
I would like to respond to the first question under A.
I just want to know how many wells have gone dry. Do we have any handle on that? And can Stetson do some kind of analysis as to how many more will go dry as the basin continues to decline?
Eddie, I think you might have missed the presentation
Yeah,
of scenarios 3, 4, and 5 that had some of that data in it.
Okay.
And in fact, do you have that tonight, Jeff?
And this is, you know, theoretical. We do. It even talks about past wells. We don't have records. We worked with the TAC on a method to try and estimate it based on the data we did have. Here it is. So this is theoretical, and this has different information. Across the top, we have historical. We've got baseline. We've got Scenario 3, which is the white paper, Scenario 4, which was the water buyout, and Scenario 5, which was the immediate halt to pumping. We have not done this analysis yet on the scenario we showed you today, 6.1 and 6.2. We intend to have that done by the board meeting. So then it's different time periods are shown down the left-hand column, different years when these impacts would have occurred. And then there's a pair of columns under each one of the scenarios or conditions that show the cumulative impacts and cumulative mitigation costs. And basically, the estimate is something like 91 wells would have been impacted already. And then let's talk about Scenario 4, which is similar to, at least in the total amount of water that's taken out, as in Scenario 6.2 we saw today. The estimate is that by I can't read it. Is that 25? Or, I don't have a copy of it.
Did you use a specific number for each well mitigation, like 75,000 or something?
Bingo. That's exactly the number. And that's, you know, that's more than it costs to re-drill a well. But there's a lot of uncertainties in what we do. Can you re-drill in the same area or not? How will you really do that? So that's all that's in that number at this point.
Yeah.
I have a question about the background information. What does M&I stand for?
Municipal and industrial.
And are we defining that a particular way?
Where is it? Do you see that used?
It's in the question.
It's in the background
They didn't
information. They use it all the time. Non-M&I pumpers, total non-M&I pumping, M&I allocation, M&I producers, non-M&I.
It's essentially what they called non-domestic users.
Well, sometimes they say
No.
non-M&I, and sometimes they say M&I,
Right.
and I can't
Let's be
tell
careful.
what they mean in each particular
It's
category.
a disconnect between Scenario 6 and the questions in terminology.
Sorry, I found mine. Sorry. Okay. M&I is a common term we use for municipal industrial. It means things like what the water district is pumping. We've been using slightly different terms here in this basin. Here in this basin, we've been referring to domestic municipal versus, non-domestic or ag and industrial. And in these questions, when they say M&I, they mean the water district, the mutuals, the de minimis pumpers.
Okay, so when they're saying transfers are allowed among MNI producers and non-MNI pumpers that are eligible for the ag industrial pool, I guess I just don't understand all the MNI terminology. Whether you're a non-MNI pumper or an MNI producer.
Well,
I would like for them to not use an abbreviation and actually spell out exactly who they mean when they refer to all of these different groups.
I think what they were trying to do was clarify, and it didn't help, that they changed the terminology from domestic, from M&I to non-M&I, and it was the categorization that was used in scenario 6 versus here, and the idea of that particular item, number 4 on this sheet, was to clarify that transfers could be done both ways. In terms, you could transfer your water rights, you could sell them, whatever.
Yeah, when they say non-M&I in this sheet, they mean large and small ag and Searles Valley Minerals industrial use.
I wonder if they meant to say municipal and domestic M&D. I think that's the language that you guys may have used earlier, or something approximating that. I wonder if this is a typo.
You're right. We in this basin have been using one set of terminology. The attorneys are using another set of terminology that is very common in the water industry, but we haven't been sticking to that in this basin.
Then I think they should, as Camille said, define it in writing.
Okay.
Let's go back to number 8, because I would like to answer the first two questions in that part. And my answer is, those are not policy questions. Those are technical questions that should be discussed and answered by the technical committee. How can a group of people who are here dealing with policy issues decide whether 63,836 is a proper number of acre feet?
Judy, I think
we have no basis. We have no basis by which to base our decisions. This is something that should be discussed in the Technical Advisory Committee.
it is being discussed in both committees, and my opinion, I had the same opinion to a point. There is a technical component and there is a policy component. If you look at the slide behind my head, when we're looking at what is an acceptable minimum criteria for total pumping for the basin with regards to impact on shallow wells going dry as just one criteria, that's a policy question. There are technical impacts to that, but that has a policy impact also. And they're asking for recommendations from a policy perspective. There are directly impacts at the technical level. I agree entirely. In fact, all this technical work had to be done to inform and allow us to have a policy discussion.
I'll again just say that I think this is quite premature and we don't have enough information, and there's a lot of assumptions in here that require just the 1, 2, 3, and 4 are riddled with assumptions. And just to take Part A, should a portion of ag industrial pool be earmarked for dust mitigation? Well, if you guys are putting Mojave Pistachios out of business in 8 months, what do you do with all of our ground if we don't have any water left? It's just wild to me that what it looks like me what's been done is, yes, we've asked for a way to have some type of substantive input, and dumping a whole bunch of information and throwing a whole bunch of questions literally hours or minutes after a meeting is started is not a good way to run a meeting and not a good way to ask for substantive policy discussion. So, again, I will say this should have gone out days ago in order to give us time to talk with our lawyers, our constituents, and if it wasn't, then it should have not been on this agenda and should have been on another agenda. This is unfair.
If I could add to what Judy said, could we have the previous slide up on the screen?
47?
Whatever it was, I don't know the number. The
criteria?
Yeah. Okay, the very first bullet, available water and storage is the main consideration influencing project management actions and sustainable management criteria. So that number, the water and storage, is a critical number. And I believe, and correct me, Jeff, if I'm wrong, we're assuming 1.5 million acre feet?
We went through a discussion of that with the TAC at the last TAC meeting, and depending which one of the technical studies you start with, the range comes out to 1 million to 1.5 million to maybe approaching a couple of million acre feet.
Okay, it was my understanding it was accepted to be about 1.5 million, and I believe that was based on the 1993 Bureau of Rec study that was done, which is over 25 years old. And to expand on something Tim Parker said earlier, which we had a discussion this morning, and this isn't a criticism of Stetson by any means, it's not intended to be, but there is better data available. I mean, we've had a Brown and Caldwell model that's been updated through the Navy DRI, through the Stanford Gap project. There's been aerial geophysical work done. There's been a hydrological conceptual model developed with TDS information that's updated, better information about where water is, where the salinity, where the saline water is. And I just think that to throw a number here, and I know where the number came from, I understand that, but I don't know, personally, I don't have confidence what percentage is that water of what's in storage. Is it 10%? Is it 50%? I don't know. I think the point I'm trying to make is there's better information available, but I understand the predicament that Stetson is in. I mean, we're facing a very tough timeline, and to go back and maybe redo things is going to, throw the whole schedule out of kilter. But to ask us to make a decision, is that the right number? My point is, I can't give you good feedback because I'm not sure that the number they're using is a valid number for what's in storage.
If you have the shallow well numbers and the fact that we've been mining the valley for 60-plus years in overdraft, does the absolute floor matter, or does that tell us if it is in fact a proxy for the potable storage in the valley, given the uncertainties, which is the first model there, or the first one on the bottom of this slide? Does that indicate, from a layman's point of view, it doesn't matter if it's 3 million or 1 million? We're seeing the effects after 60 years of mining now. We've already had, 91 wells go dry today. So does that and some of the water quality depletions that we've seen, do those give you a policy sense that we're near a tipping point at this point? That's my question. And I'm seeing enough data to make me say, if you look at the numbers, more than double between the scenarios that didn't have much change in water used above 68, we were more than doubling the wells going dry every period.
So to that point, this number could be less than 63,000.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
And I stated that when I read the question.
Yes.
I said it could be more, it could be less.
Right.
I mean, we don't have about 63,000 acre feet. We have 63,836, no less.
Well, that's because that's what the calculation came up to.
But maybe it's too much by quite a bit.
That's what they're asking us. Is it too much?
Well,
Is it not enough?
I have no technical expertise to base my decision on. I would expect to have something from the technical committee come out on this issue.
Well, I think that's what that last slide was with regards to the results of the modeling on scenarios 3, 4, and 5 and why they're completing
If we
6
could go
and
back to
6.1.
that slide that has all the number of wells that were historically have gone dry and are supposed to go dry in the future, I believe that Jean Moran, when she gave that presentation, said that 91 is a hypothetical number based off of modeling, and they've correlated.
It's not based off of the modeling. It's based on, and this was worked out with the TAC, a methodology to look at what data we had on wells with a bunch of assumptions about based on when they were drilled, what was the practice at the time about how far below the water table people went, and then they did use the model to look at the change in water levels in the future and said, okay, based on these assumptions about how they were drilled, based on the date they were drilled, here's how the water level impacts going forward impact those wells.
I remember Gene saying that of the 91 wells, they actually found 3 specific wells that went dry that they were able to tie to those 91. Like, did that 91 is not they found 91 specific identifiable well numbers that they all found that had gone dry that they proved that was because of dewatering and wasn't from any other cause?
That is correct. That 91 does not represent wells that we went out and identified had gone dry. That is a theoretical number.
Okay, and I remember Gene saying that they actually correlated them to they've only found 3 examples of an actual like numbered latitude, longitudinal, specifically actual drilled well that they can prove has gone dry.
Mine is one of the 3, I believe.
But I'm just saying again that when we talk about do we have enough information?
In my neighborhood, I can show you probably that I know have been redrilled. Just a second. 5 or 6 within sight of my well.
Right, and I'm just saying that when we talk about data gaps, I just want to, we're throwing around these numbers here that 91 is, I'm not saying negatively that it's a hypothetical number because I realize all models are based off of, but that 91 is not that there's been 91 identified homeowners or people who've had a well that's gone dry.
That is correct.
Okay.
I want to say something regarding this shallow well impact summary. If you look at it where it says scenario number 4, and you go down to 2040, and it guesstimates that 31 more wells by the year 2040 will go dry, shallow wells. And then you look at scenario number 5, which was the immediate halt pumping, and less than half of the wells that would have gone dry in 2040 in the scenario number 4, they predict 13 would go dry under scenario number 5. So to answer your question regarding could we go below the 63,836 acre feet in trying to save more shallow wells from going dry, we could go below that because they also give a cumulative cost of mitigation. It goes into the millions of dollars for a small number of wells. And I don't know where the GA is going to come up with that money because somebody's probably going to have to mitigate the costs of those wells going dry.
I'll also say that when Attorney Markman gave the presentation to us about the cost of potential litigation, he said that for an individual claimant, it could be as much as $250,000 a year, and that for a city or a county can be upwards of $1 million a year, and that they can take over 10 years. So just want to throw that out there, that in addition to well mitigation costs, there's also legal ramifications to the policy decisions that are being discussed.
Just wondering if the assumption was made that wells last forever, so they should go 40, 50 years. That's not really the case.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the reasons we were asked to come up with the discussion we had regarding shallow well mitigation and how to determine the reason a well had gone dry, whether it was actually attributable to the lowering depth in the aquifer or not.
There you go. Now you're getting. That's what I was going to say. No, wells don't normally last forever, but they should last a long time based on if the water table didn't go down. That's exactly why I had to deepen mine. When the water table got down below the screened interval, what happened? My steel casing.
I would like to remind the Policy Advisory Committee that we all voted and accepted the outline prepared by Gene Moran on shallow wells. Mm-hmm. And if the water table is dropping at 2 feet per year, it's not going to take a whole long time to get below the screened interval. Which
Another
is,
point to
which
be
is,
made
I guess,
here.
what happened to you, Lyle.
Another point to be made is that we had an ad hoc committee that came up with a shallow well failure mitigation document. And we were
was
very
originally
careful.
written by Gene Moran, and we elaborated on it. Yes.
Correct. And we were very careful to be sure that we did not include in any shallow well mitigation a well that did not fail other than due to lowering of groundwater levels or lowering of groundwater quality. So we made a very careful distinction. We put a lot of burden on the well owner that we would not be repairing things that he should have repaired. So that was something we considered closely.
I wonder at what point it's appropriate to say that it's 8:30 and that there's a lot of substantive discussion here and that we talked about having another meeting. At what point should we
Yeah,
decide?
I'm approaching that. I was going to bring up a couple points and then ask that we decide on a path forward. And I think that's appropriate, Josh. Could you put up what in my packet is the last slide in scenario number 6.1? It was slide 23 when it was a standalone. It may be 24. 6.1 scenario.
Trying to get there.
It's the last slide, the change in basin groundwater storage. Looks like that. Top one.
It's not doing anything at the moment.
It's not doing anything right now, is it?
Nope.
Try pointing it that way. It's not doing it either, huh?
Nope.
I don't see that.
Is it tired? Red. Red's not
It's
good.
it compares. It's a good companion chart for the one we just looked at with shallow well mitigation or shallow well impacts, because it shows the change in groundwater storage between each of scenarios 3, 4, 5, and 6.1, which actually of all the scenarios run to date, 0 through 6, counting the baseline, is the least impact to shallow wells and the least and the high reserve level for water in the basin. And what it showed, and I think is what led the GA to approach this model in particular, is that 4 and 5, which were the previous two, didn't show much difference at all, and yet there was a substantive difference in the additional number of shallow wells that were impacted, and some discussion of groundwater quality as well in other discussions, the TDS work, which we haven't done as much on each scenario, and that's why we asked the questions last month about that. This is what leads me to believe, as an engineer, that we're close to a number that's having some significant impact. And I think given the time pressure, that's why they zeroed in on that number. And how do we get to this number where we don't mine the basin anymore? It is also tied to the whole discussion about sustainable management criteria and groundwater or depth to water as a substitute for that, or water basin level, and then picking particular wells that the technical, no saliva tonight, that the technical community recommends as the most representative of the basin and critical areas in the basin. So they're looking at what is that bottom level? What is that floor level?
And I will say that's one issue. And then the second issue is who takes the cut, who takes the hit, who gets kicked out. And that decision was made in a closed-door session in a smoky room back there.
It hasn't been made yet, but
all the all the discussions even have been done in closed session.
Well, we've asked for months to have. In fact, I think the very first PAC meeting I attended a year and a half ago or longer. We've been having so much fun. I'm not sure how long that was. We asked. We want to talk about sustainable management criteria now.
And a year and a half later, they've dumped it all on us in one day.
And finally,
But they didn't really dump it on us. They gave us a bunch of questions.
they gave us some things to help recommend to them. We have some data. We have a lot of data to review. We said we need to talk about a couple things and then come back and say, And when I looked at this ahead of time, I said, we're going to need to have a meeting next week. And I know from the opposite sides of the fence that some folks are on, and the fact that some groups obviously are or have more effect than others in this, that we need to have time to digest and then come back and have a more informed discussion. So if there's a consensus that that's what we want to do, given that it's 8:30 and we need to be more informed and fresher, do we want to schedule a meeting next week that we could plan for at least 3 hours, but if we were able to do it in the daytime, we perhaps could go more if we needed to get through some level of a discussion and a majority, minority, or considerations position on these issues.
You know, you can get a good answer to a question, but if it's the wrong question, that doesn't help you.
Well, we're still the policy committee, and we can ask policy questions related to anything on here, and they opened that door for us also.
Well, I mean, if they're asking us a question with implications that are, inaccurate, we can give them an answer, but it doesn't advance us in any way.
We can give them an answer, and we can couch it just that way. How we think the question should have been answered, and perhaps an answer to that too. We are advisory.
Right.
And we've gotten to the point where they at least, yes, it's late, and yes, it was driven by when the model was finished and lawyer schedules yesterday afternoon, but they've asked us to weigh in on this, and in advance of their own public meeting, so the public's going to have a chance to weigh in and be fully informed before the GA meeting next week.
And I'll just reiterate on the record, I think that we're being given window dressing review in order to be able to go after the fact and say, no, we were transparent, we gave the PAC and the TAC review, when again, we're just getting to look at things after the fact and provide comments. We just heard from the TAC today that the comments weren't even being, properly reviewed and disseminated. So I'm just saying, again, based on past experience, this is, again, we're very late, we're very behind the 8 ball. We've known about the schedule for a very long time. The POAM hasn't even been updated for a very long time because we weren't sure what we were doing. And now we're not going to have a 90-day review period because there's not enough time. So a lot of these things about transparency and getting the TAC and the PAC involved are all just window dressing to be able to go to DWR and say we checked boxes. They're not actually there to try to allow substantive input into the plan.
Okay, you've made the point, and others have also, and we can choose now to take the opportunity we have and try to give productive inputs or not.
Yeah, what do you suggest we do, Josh? I mean, I don't disagree with you at all, but we do have an opportunity, and what do you suggest we do with it?
Do the best we can and write comment letters to DWR along the way.
Observation here. I think, probably the most important role we can play is to offer policy suggestions on the approach to coming up with these numbers. So we might say, yes, we think the domestic well failure rate, or no, we think perhaps some other factor. We don't necessarily come up with the exact number, but we either validate or make suggested changes to the approach used. Perhaps the TAC comes up with the actual number down to the acre foot or whatever.
And it could be, but there's an option related to both that we're talking about here is perhaps we can make the greater points and the points Josh has made, and I think the points Tim is referring to, while we answer the specific questions as they were given and the greater question as you implied, Tim. And what I'm hearing, what I think I'm hearing from everybody is we want to have a meeting next week. We want to take these on, plus some of the perhaps bigger context issues around them alongside it. But given the constraints, we'll answer that and the bigger two. So do we have a time that folks would be willing to meet next week? Is everybody ready to talk about that?
I'm open all week. And then also, I think if people aren't available, is it an option for them to be able to call in? Because I know some people have work and they could maybe call in for 2 or 3 hours. I don't know. So I don't know if that's an option for people.
Yeah, the issue is going to be, A, quorum. B, I don't know the legality of, I think we can have call-ins.
Yes.
If you're a committee, do you have to have a registered public site that you're calling in from so the public can attend it?
I think if they're Brown Act, I think so.
Yeah.
Even if they're not from this valley, well, if they're in the valley,
That was my question now. We get in Brown Act thing, right? So.
may not be able to have them call in.
May not be able to. We got to have an agenda in 72 hours, right?
As a member of the RCD board,
Yeah, special.
one
meeting.
of our members cannot attend because of her work schedule, and she calls in, and the county council has said it is legal. She is at her place of employment.
Okay.
Well, here's what I would suggest. Let's try first to have it face to face, because a call in makes meetings go longer. It is much less efficient. You try to fit in when others are talking, and it's very difficult. So let's see first if we can get the majority of us at least a quorum and the maximum on any particular day. Josh, you said you were free anytime.
I should be too next week. So.
I have an RCD meeting in the morning of the 7th.
If you call a special meeting, isn't there some latitude in Brown Act there too? Yeah, I think that's the number.
Yeah, I think we could go early as Monday, and then if we needed a second one, we would have time that week to do it. Are there folks that could do it Monday during the day or evening?
Monday is not good for me. I'm gone Monday and Tuesday to meet my new grandson in Bozeman.
You got the right priority.
Yep.
I'm available.
I'm not going to miss that.
Yeah, I have a board meeting for the TV booster Monday evening, but I could otherwise come Monday.
Are there folks that can do Tuesday afternoon?
Yep.
Was that a no, Judy?
No, that's a yes.
No. There's a water district committee meeting.
I can't. Do you have to be there?
What about Wednesday or Thursday afternoon?
Part of the water district.
Thursday and Friday doesn't work for me.
Yeah, if we're
But Wednesday is good.
If we go Thursday or later, we're really locked in.
What about Wednesday?
Wednesday sounds good to me.
Wednesday afternoon?
Yeah, Wednesday anytime for me is fine, but
Okay, I'd like to give us the most. Oh, that's city council night. We'd have to be out of here by 5.
could we do Wednesday at 1 and pray to the heavens that we're done in 4 hours?
Yep.
We'd be shorter than the city council meeting. Sorry, Peggy.
But I think if we did Wednesday at 1, we had a focused agenda, and then if we could get the agenda out by Friday, we could all have the weekend and Monday and Tuesday to talk to our constituent groups, and then we should be able to all show up Wednesday at 1 a little more informed to have a substantive discussion, if that works for everybody.
That's fine.
Wednesday sounds good.
Okay, let's do Wednesday at 1. Is there anyone that can't do that Wednesday at 1? You cannot? Okay, you're non-voting. I'm sorry, Tom. We'll keep it Wednesday at 1, and we'll remember the ecosystems for you. No, we're talking August 7th, 1 o'clock. We'll see if we can do it here. If we can't do it here, Don, can we do it at the Water District?
There is a committee meeting at 3 o'clock on that afternoon in the boardroom.
Okay. If we'll find out tomorrow morning if we can do it here Wednesday at 1.
And if there's a Kerr McGee Center or anyone else that has a cost associated with the meeting, if it's nominal or whatever, we would cover that.
Yeah. The issue is this is a pretty important public meeting. You really want televised.
Yeah, and if they don't have enough in the budget to televise it, we'd cover that too, because I think having it recorded and televised is important. So if it's not in the budget, or if we need to find a different building, we would cover those costs.
Okay, so we're talking about convening a special full PAC meeting Wednesday, 1 o'clock here, and we'll take these issues up. And as a reminder, we don't have to come up with a unified policy recommendation. At the very least, what we should be able to do is have a discussion of these issues and the factors on each side of them, answering the specific questions and then the greater issues if we have some that we think, or an alternate question that might have been posed and issues that surround that. So we'll start.
Maybe we should develop our own set of. Maybe we should develop our own set of questions for the GA board.
Well, let's not add overly to our task. Let's stick with answering the questions that we've got before us. At least define the issues surrounding them, and if there's additional information and things we would have recommended getting from the TAC, then that's fine. Then we can go to the larger scale, but let's prioritize ourselves so we at least get answers given the context.
And then if we have written comments, we can provide them to you on Wednesday, and then they'll go to the board, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We'll do that the way we always do. If we have written comments on these, you'll be providing written comments on all the data presented today and the questions. And those will be posted, all of this will be posted as the information for this meeting. So you'll see both of Stetson's presentation, Jeff, all of Stetson's presentations, including the shallow well data we talked about, everything that was seen here tonight, and the questions will be posted together with the agenda for this meeting, and we'll have 2 or 3 agenda items, including order and adjourn. We'll focus on this. We'll focus on answering the specific questions and the greater questions around them, and if we have time, some additional questions. So that's our priority. We'll probably have to be done, is that correct, Peggy, by 5?
We'll have our closed session.
So we got to be out before 5.
So you have to be out, give us a few minutes.
So 4:45? Okay. So we'll have 3 hours and 45 minutes, and we'll be chopped liver by then anyway. So put your thought into it. Come ready to discuss it fairly and open-mindedly, and we'll get to, given we're at least going to give some good solid information and feedback on where we are, where our constituents are, leading into the board meeting 2 weeks. Public comment on that approach? On that approach, yeah. Yeah, please come to the mic.
Yes, Doreen Conaway Baker from Sierra Shadows Ranch. On all of the sustainability, and you keep hearing the word uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. So what percent of uncertainty in your plan, in your scenarios, that is going to be sent to DWR for approval? What's the percentage of uncertainty that will be acceptable and not acceptable? Is 20% acceptable? 30, 50? What is the percentage?
Thank you. I don't know that that's specifically known. It'll be the best we have. I think what they're trying to do is the best we have at the time and update it. They're required to update it at a minimum, I think, 5 years. And the plans that I have heard discussed is updated as more information comes. Don, were you leaning forward to make a comment? No, I'm okay, Jeff, do you have a comment and answer to that?
That's right. The SIGMA and the DWR guidelines don't really address an allowable amount of uncertainty, and they know some basins don't know much about their basins, and others have better data. They anticipate you'll use the best you have, and that's going to vary. And the proof is in our milestones as we go forward, and we set things we're going to measure. We're going out and physically measure them. That's where you really know how good your information was.
Well, and the WRM said today that that the GSP will in fact have thresholds that you will make changes if you see that you're not going to be making them. So you'll be adjusting. It's a living plan.
It is. I mean, we were supposed to make the best plan we can. We have to review it every 5 years, and if we have better information, or if we're not meeting our milestones, we have to change our plan to accommodate all
And you
those
don't have
things.
to wait 5 years. That's a
No,
minimum.
That is a minimum.
Can I? And some of us won't be around in 5 years. Mojave Pistachio has 8 months, according to a scenario. You know, what if the information that you have gathered within the first 3 years says he could have at least got 5 more years out of the deal? You know, I mean, this is a big, you know, you're talking about people's livelihoods. So much money is invested, and it's, if you don't have the skin in the game, it doesn't necessarily affect you.
Doreen, I think you're asking the wrong group. This is a question for you to ask the GA board.
I understand that. I do understand that. I'm just saying that all of these words in every one of these screens is, you hear the word uncertainty in 15 times on one slide. It just seems like with that many uncertainties, maybe we should get a little bit more information.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, member comment to close the meeting. Oh, wait a minute. Let me see if we had any other. We did the imported water updates, the future agenda items. We've got the draft GSP, and we'll likely have Chapter 2, not next week. Next meeting is one topic, and it's next Wednesday. The following meeting after that, we'll update what those are. Future PAC meetings next Wednesday, September 5th, October 3rd, November 7th. Closing comments from members? Let's start with Tim.
None.
I've said enough.
I have none.
It is unacceptable to give a group a document and expect them to discuss it intelligently a couple of hours later. It's just not acceptable.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I always like to look for the other side of coins, and all along we've complained that the Groundwater Authority is not making the tough decisions. They're not moving forward. They walk around tarred and feathered. It looks to me like they are starting now to approach the tough decisions, and we have been given a chance to comment on what appears to be an approach they're considering. We've taken the flexibility to possibly offer alternatives on our next meeting. So enjoy your tar and feather for giving us a short notice. Just put it on top of the other tar and feathering. It looks like, you know, I do see very real progress in the direction of making the hard decisions.
Two items. First, on the importing and Capital Corps, did they say when, Don, they might have the product that was due a few days ago?
No, they did not commit to a day, but I mean, they were working on it. But again, basically all the resources were dedicated to making that deadline to get that grant application in, which was a very short window. So as soon as I can, you know, contact them tomorrow and see where they're at.
Okay. Second item. Yeah, and looking at the questions given us, I know I appreciate the time between now and next Wednesday to consider them, and in particular, Tim's idea of the broader question, are the right questions. Are these really the right ones? And so I'm looking forward to the meeting, and I especially appreciate the time that has been set aside and your efforts in getting together a special meeting for next Wednesday.
I just want to say that I'm committed to getting this GSP done, and despite everybody complaining, I just want to keep moving forward. I want to get this done. Thank you.
Just a small earthquake update. We did have one of our wells up on by very far north Brown Road go down after the earthquake, and we luckily had another well that we drilled that we had a hole, so we were able to move equipment over and all that, and the trees weren't affected or anything, but just want to point out that there are other reasons besides groundwater pumping to cause wells to go bad, because one just happened to us, and it was a brand new well. So, thank you.
Thanks. I think thanks for doing a few arenas. I know the review time we've had has not been sufficient nor acceptable in some cases. I know we've been talking about this for a long time. I know the progress has been slow, but I want to thank what I think was a best foot forward, honest effort to get the PAC involved and the public involved in some key issues at a critical juncture, as West alluded to. And I know there were supporters on the board that allowed this to happen or forced this and helped us to be able to address these. And I applaud them for that, the support along with the tar and feathers, as West mentioned. I want to thank the PAC membership for being flexible and signing up for a meeting, committing to a meeting next week. Exactly the words Renee just kind of said. We can complain, we can note our displeasure, but we're going to move forward and do the best positive job we can with what we have and the best advice and discussion and provide that to them. I thank you all for that. I think that's a good part of the relationships we had formed up till this time. Last, Stetson is in the middle of this. They're the guys that have had to execute whatever direction and suffer the slings and arrows of being the middleman for much of this as well. I know you guys have been working lots overtime. You driving home tonight, Jeff? Okay, good. You're a wise man for a change. Didn't mean it that way. Thank you so much. Pass it to Steve. I know he in particular is in that position. Look forward to seeing everybody on Wednesday. Thank you all. Thanks to the public for coming to these. So with that, we're adjourned.